So good evening to our audience here at the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe, as well as to our online audience. Considering that it's a very beautiful day outside, we appreciate that you chose to join us here for the very timely but also complex and often difficult debate on migration challenges in national and European politics. My name is Malvina Talik. I'm research associate here at the IDM, and I will be guiding you through today's event. I will be also sharing some insights during the panel discussion later on. This event is a result of collaboration of the IDM together with Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe and the French Institute of International Relations. We thank both institutions for this fruitful cooperation. And now let me pass the floor for introductory remarks to Director of the IDM, Mr. Sebastian Schäfer.
Thank you, Malvina. I can only echo what you said. I'm very glad that we have this cooperation. I'm very glad that this is something unique for us in the sense that we normally work very much in Central and Eastern Europe. And this time we have two partners from a Western European country that will help us to broaden the view. I think it's very necessary nowadays in the European Union to not forget that, of course, the key driver of European integration cannot work without also including the traditional motor, which is France and of course Germany. But at the same time, we also need to face new realities, which is that Central and Eastern Europe, and I count Austria very much to that, is going to be the future, especially when it comes to European integration. Now, European integration can only happen if we are also able to tackle the challenges of our time. I think we have three main challenges that we are facing and that the next Commission is going to face in our days. This is, on the one hand, of course, the prevention of the climate catastrophe. This is, of course, the unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine from the side of the Russian Federation. And the third major challenge is going to be how do we I wouldn't even call it a challenge, I would call it an opportunity. How do we deal with the opportunity of migration in Europe? And I'm also very happy that we not only have fantastic panelists, but I'm also very happy that we made this cooperation happen. And I also personally would like to thank very much, of course, the partners from the Austrian-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe and the IFRI in France. It's fantastic to have you here. It's fantastic to do this collaboration, but I'm also on a, so to say, IDM internally basis very happy because Malvina is an expert working on this topic for quite some time, and she asked me if we can do more in this regard. And of course, I promise to do everything that we will have more on this topic and more opportunities for Malvina to show her expertise. And therefore, I'm very happy that basically I just have to say a few welcome words and the rest came together organically. Thank you very much for your interest here. Thank you very much for watching. We will, of course, also make it available afterwards. And if you want to rewatch it or pass it on to the people who didn't make it. And without further ado, I would directly invite maybe Rainer Münz for his keynote, so I can already set up his PowerPoint.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It's quite unusual in an Austro-French cooperation situation to speak in English. But as I'm also speaking some English, so it should work. Yeah, it's quite unusual. I think 20 years ago it would not have been possible to do that. So I'm not sure whether I should see this as a progress or not. But anyhow, so you're gonna get a presentation in English. But I'm happy to take questions in German and French as well, right? So I'll give you 3 layers. The first is, who are the migrants living in Europe? Migrants defined as people living outside their country of birth. The second question is, what are the flows that we can observe or have observed over the past 10 years? And there, I'm not sure whether I would join your assessment that it's an opportunity. And the third one is just to look into, and catering to the topic of today's seminar, asking ourselves what are the political challenges or the policy layer. So if you take Europe without Russia, you have 69 million people living outside their country of birth, basically in the US and UK. Of them, 56 million are residents of the European Union. So that's a basic, how you say, demography of the stock of migrants. So we're talking about something like 13% of the total EU population here. So when you then break it down, is 56, 57 million, you get to 42 million born outside the EU and some 14 million intra-EU. So the 42 million is probably an underestimate because not all countries are reporting Ukrainians under temporary protection as foreign residents. Poland, for example, and this reduces the number already by about 1.5 million people. So when you look at the countries of Europe, you see that the percentage of people born outside the country we're looking at is very uneven. So we have a few tiny countries like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, which have a high percentage. The country with the highest percentage is not mentioned here, but apparently it must be the Vatican. So in the Vatican, about 99.9% of the population foreign born and have immigrated. But we're excluding also Monaco and a few other tiny countries. So if you take the, I'm sorry to say, more serious countries, then Luxembourg is the first, and Liechtenstein. So among the larger countries, Switzerland is the country with the highest percentage of foreign-born people. We're talking about 30% foreign-born in Switzerland, and then we have a group of countries where it's say between 25 and 15%. Austria here with some 22%, and France here with some say 15% maybe. So the percentage of people born outside the country in Austria is about 1.5 times larger than in France, just to give you a perspective. But as France is a much larger country and a much larger population, the absolute number of foreign-born people in France is 5 times, 6 times larger than in Austria, right? So, and then we have a few countries where there's almost nobody born outside the country, with a few, how to say, question marks behind, because nowadays, with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians living in Poland, in Slovakia, in Romania, the real percentage will be higher than that. So when we look at the flows, we look at people who have come from outside the EU to the EU over the past 10 years. So we're looking at the period of time between 2013 and 2022. The 23 data are not yet available. You see that we had 22 million people who have immigrated from outside the EU to the 27 EU countries. 1/3 of them in 2022 alone. So 1/3 of the total inflow has happened in just 1 year, 2/3 have happened in the other 9 years, this time span. We have about 13 million EU citizens who have been moving between EU countries, and we have 10 million people who have left the European Union during the same period of time. So the demographic net gain would be 12 million people, but as we have more people dying than being born, the effect on the absolute number of people living in Europe is smaller. So when you take a closer look, on what grounds did people come? So we have 7 million asylum seekers, first asylum seekers. We have 6 million cases of marriage, migration, and family reunion. We have about 4 million Ukrainians. We have less than 4 million cases of employment. And this is the reason why I'm putting a question mark behind the opportunity idea of migration. We did not bring people to Europe or let people in who were readily joining the labor market. But we know that people who come as refugees and people who come as dependent family members do not readily, I mean, the majority of them does not readily enter the labor market. It takes 10 to 15 years till their labor market performance reaches the same as the people, so as that of the natives, let's put it that way. So you can say, yes, we've got people and it has increased the number of people living here, but you can put a question mark whether we got the right kind of people seen from a narrow European point of interest, right? That's my point here. That's just, I mean, looking in the future, you can say that's too low. Yeah? If just 15% of all people coming join the labor market, yeah, you can ask yourself. I'm not saying the others are not going to work, but it will take time, right? So now, when you look at the countries, you see the country that has had the largest inflow is Germany, which has attracted more than 25%, about 25% of all people coming from the outside to the EU. But basically, in Germany, you have the same picture. You have first asylum, you have family reunion, you have Ukrainian under temporary protection, almost no employment. Just 10% of the inflow of migrants to Germany from other non-EU countries were people who have been selected because of their talent and skill. When we go to France, the second largest recipient, we have a situation that is even less favorable, because basically immigration to France over the past 10 years has been family reunion, asylum, then a big chunk education. This has to do with the fact that France is offering opportunities for people who already speak French or want to learn French to get a higher education there. And the little green spot here in the lower left right corner is the employment in case of France, the yellow one. So it's again 10% of the inflow. In Spain, the ratio is a bit better. We have about 20%, more than 20% of the people who have joined Spain were working. We look at Italy, yeah, a similar situation. Sweden, again, and then when you can look into other countries where the Ukrainians are the dominant inflow, like in Poland, like in the Czech Republic. So we have a mix between Ukrainians under temporary protection and employment. In Poland, as the social provisions are much lower than in other parts of Europe, most Ukrainians who have decided to stay in Poland are also part of the workforce, are working. In Austria, for example, less than 25% of all adult Ukrainians who have arrived in Europe, in Austria over the past 2 years have joined the labor market. By contrast, just to give you that. So now we move into asylum. So we break down these 6 million asylum requests, and then you see, I mean, as we all know, we had a large inflow of people from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, in particular in 2015-16, and then numbers were receding. And so we have a new increase. We had over 1 million asylum requests in the year 2023. We already had some 850,000 in 2022. The main countries of origin is still Syria and Afghanistan. We also see people coming from Venezuela and Colombia, and by the way, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. In several years, the Latin Americans asking for asylum, the number was higher than the number of Syrians. But when you follow the news, you never heard of a Latin American refugee crisis here. This has to do with the fact that the Latin American refugees or asylum seekers come with a passport and an airline ticket and have a regular entry because they don't need Schengen visa. They can just enter the Schengen and the EU without notifying anyone. They come as travelers, and then after having entered EU territory, they ask for asylum. Whereas the Syrians but there is a lot more difficult to get on EU territory because they have no direct possibility to fly into Europe. Right? This is changing now because the nature of asylum is changing for bureaucratic reasons. In Austria, for example, the majority of asylum seekers now are not people crossing the border, but are people also coming by airplane or children being born in Austrian hospitals, because children to refugees in Austria and in Germany have to ask for asylum at the day of birth. And family members reuniting with recognized refugees are also counted as asylum seekers. If you would organize the statistics in a different way, then the number of asylum seekers in Europe would be much lower. Now, last part of my short presentation, migration policy. So the EU and its neighborhood has common, competing and diverging interests that you can see. So almost all countries now agree on the idea, although some say it louder, some less, that the idea is to have as little asylum seekers as possible. Whether these people are legitimate refugees or not, the common interest now is to keep it at a lower scale. And this feeds into this idea of having asylum seekers processed outside European Union territory. So that's all the discourse about the external platform. Italy is the only country that has managed that by having an agreement with Albania, but that can only be seen as a test case because it's going to be 3,000 people a year by, I don't know, 120,000 people arriving in Italy in an irregular manner every year. So it's only a trial and error basket. So then the other thing that EU countries, but also Western Balkan countries are happy to do is wave people through. So turning a blind eye or hoping that these people will disappear tomorrow. Everybody does. And then we have seen migration arrangements with neighboring countries. I'll come to that in a second. And then something that is just about to come, some countries are already in that box, others not, is how to attract skilled migrants, right? So I start with the irregular border crossings. That's the main topic for countries like Italy, Greece, France, Spain. For Spain, it's also the Atlantic route, people coming from Northwestern Africa and moving to the Canary Islands. In Austria and in our eastern and southeastern neighborhood, that's the Western Balkan route that is here at the forefront of considerations. There's a little bit of people moving from Eastern Europe across the Belarusian border, or Finnish border into Northwestern Europe. What we should not forget is that the irregular flow via the Mediterranean, the Western Balkans, is less than 20% of all flows to Europe. And maybe a third of all asylum cases only. So that's the numbers. the numbers that you see. So the main avenue is from Libya and Tunisia to Italy. Then we have people moving into Spain more via the Atlantic than via the Straits of Gibraltar. There were about 60,000 people who have crossed the Aegean last year. And we have seen about 100,000 people identified of having crossed the Western Balkans. There's double counting because some people are entering via the Mediterranean, particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, that are counted a second time when leaving EU territory and then re-entering at the border of Hungary and Croatia. So again, 380,000 irregular crossings, of them double count, compared to 1 million asylum requests in the year 2023, just to give you a perspective. The majority of asylum seekers in Europe does not come via the Mediterranean. The vast majority of migrants to Europe does not come via the Mediterranean. About 80–90% of the political energy and debate goes into that part. Not in the Western Balkans, but in Brussels. Been working there for 5 years. I was responsible for the portfolio and tell you more details about that. The media attention is there, the political attention is there, the political effort basically goes into that. So then the next layer of policy making is the question of responsibility. For people asking for asylum, this is the country of first arrival. Italy and Greece try to reduce that by waving people further north. Is it the country where the first asylum request is made? This would work if the Dublin Agreement would work and people could be sent back to that country, but the Dublin Agreement is not working, so people can ask for asylum in a few countries, not just in one. And then within the country granting asylum, who is responsible is also not clear. If you take the Austrian case, you see that most provinces are happy if the burden is on Vienna. So you have an uneven distribution because, like in Europe, also within the EU member states, some regions are attractive, not only for regular migrants, but also for asylum seekers, and others are less attractive. That is, what is the responsibility of transit countries? So some transit countries only reduce that to the idea that they should not completely mistreat these people. And then we have this issue of European solidarity. Do have non-Mediterranean countries a responsibility to come to help, in the case of Italy and Greece, in a situation where there's a lot more asylum seekers in Germany than in Italy. But then the question is warranted, or is this solidarity idea something that is basically drummed up by the loudest politician? In that case, Mrs. Meloni, most likely. So next thing is the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians by law have the right to reside in Europe wherever they want. And this has led to a completely uneven distribution. So almost no Ukrainians in France. There's plenty of Ukrainians in Germany and Poland, if you look at the. We're not talking about Ukrainian citizens, we're talking about Ukrainians living under temporary protection who have entered since March 2022. So that's the situation here. And the labor force participation of these people is also very uneven, very low in Austria and Germany, Switzerland, much higher in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and in Poland, which can be linked to the level of welfare provisions that you can tap into if you have that status. So this is the largest inflow ever into the European Union since the European Union exists. There's never been such a large inflow in any year since the 1950s that we had it in 2022. Now, something that is also not working is returning people with no valid residence permit. So we have maybe 600,000 people without valid residence permit, of whom 450,000 are getting an order to leave the country on an annual basis. And we have returns in recent years below 100,000 a year. So we manage, maybe the success rate is about 20%. So let me finish by looking at the migration deals. The most successful one is the migration deal between the EU and Turkey. It's important to note that this is not a state treaty, but it's an exchange of letters. You can see a gentleman's agreement between two sides who are not gentlemen. Because the Turks are not doing everything they promise, and we are also not doing everything we have promised. If you just look at the EU side, we have promised the Turks speedier accession negotiations, visa-free travel for all Turkish citizens into the Schengen area, relocation of maybe 100,000 Syrians every year, among, say, more important things that were on our side of the letter. The Turks have said we'll never ever let anyone go. That's also not exactly what has happened, but say by and large, Turkey has kept a large majority of Syrians off its territory. A deal that has already collapsed is the one with Tunisia. So there was already more euphoria among the Europeans, as you can see. It's only the Tunisian president that looks not, doesn't seem to be the happiest person on the photograph. If you read, if you want to read the mimics here. So Tunisia has already decided not to live up to the treaty and has sent part of the money back. This has never happened before, something like that. That you already have the EU money in your pockets and say, no, thank you. So the most recent is with Egypt. Here the mimics is not so clear. Both sides don't seem to be fully happy here. The reason why we are dealing with Egypt now on an express lane has basically to do with the Houthi. Egypt loses about 6 to 7% of its GDP because the Suez Canal is basically empty, nobody's using it. And so the fiscal position of Egypt has become extremely fragile. Now this is why we're actually hoping to stabilize the country before tens or hundreds of thousands of people decide to leave. By the way, a complete invasion of the Gaza Strip and a relocation of the people living in Gaza towards Egypt would have a similar effect, by the way, because these people would also probably rather quickly move towards Libya and get on boats towards Europe. So having a ceasefire or a peace agreement in the Gaza Strip is, from a European point of view, of extreme importance in order to avoid the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, just as a footnote here. So then we have migration deals on our own. The best functioning bilateral migration deal without any question is between Spain and Morocco. They're usually the EU is not involved. And I was in Brussels, people were saying, don't get into that. We manage. It's better if you don't touch. Occasionally it doesn't work because there is irritations between Rabat and Madrid, but normally it works quite well, which allows Spain to have massive pushbacks and just send people back into Morocco. Not only Moroccan citizens, but also third country nationals. And so Morocco effectively prevents hundreds of thousands of people crossing into European Union territory. In particular, the most fragile situation is in the exclave of Ceuta and Melilla, where Spain and Morocco share a common land border. And then sometimes we're taking this also in our own hands. When you look at this migration summit there, I would say that Mr. Nehammer looks more satisfied maybe than Mr. Orban, but I might be wrong on that, or maybe there's other reasons for that. So there's a kind of an attempt from the Austrian side and probably also supported by Germany to try to reduce flows through the Western Balkans. The main negotiations here, for example, the case of Bosnia or of Serbia, is to convince countries like Serbia or Bosnia to not to have visa-free travel from India, from Pakistan, from many other countries in the world into Sarajevo or into Belgrade. Because this is one of the ways of avoiding crossing the Mediterranean and still being able of crossing into EU territory is by flying into the Western Balkans and then taking the road from there. So these are the Austria is also supporting Hungary when it comes to border policing, catching people who are organizing people smuggling. To our dismay, last year, Hungary has set free all the convicted smugglers, arguing that it would be too costly to have them in Hungarian prison for an extended period of time. So basically, I would say that's it. The final challenge that we're happy to discuss with you then is the question, how do we deal with the situation that will come as next one, which is a scarcity of labor, where the EU countries will, today they are negative competitors. Everybody tries to have as little asylum seekers as possible. In the next stage, over the next 20 years or more, the EU countries will become positive competitors in the sense that they will try to become more attractive for labor migrants. In both cases, it's very difficult to organize solidarity. The main argument is that the generation going into retirement today is about 30% larger than the generation moving out of the domestic education systems into the labor market. And the main question is how to fill that gap. So let me stop here and thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Williams, for this overview. I think it offers a good starting point for our discussion, to which we will proceed now. If you have any questions or you would like to react to this keynote lecture, please do it in the Q&A session, which we'll have after the discussion. So now, for this topic, we brought for you experts from different corners of Europe. As Sebastian already mentioned, we have guests from France, for example. So I'd like to welcome Catherine Vitold-de-Benten, Director of Research at the Center for International Studies in Paris.
Yes.
I also like to welcome Maurizio Ambrosini, Professor of Sociology and Migration at the University of Milan and Senior Advisor at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Welcome. With us is also Alida Vracic, co-founder and executive directress of Populari, member of Balkans in Europe Policy Advisor Group from Sarajevo. Welcome. And to my left is Vit Loušek, Vice Dean for Research and Doctoral Studies at the Faculty of Social Studies at Masaryk University, Brno.
Good afternoon.
So we have heard a lot from the European perspective, also from national countries in some respects. I would like to hear your reactions partially to this keynote lecture and also regional and national perspectives on new dynamics in migration flows in your countries. And I would like to start with you, Catherine. So
Yes, thank you.
from the most Western country, from our perspective, what are these flows?
Thank you for this invitation, and I have been very interested with the presentation from Rainer Münz. I want to say that in France, there are 10.2% migrants, and the average number in Europe is 10%. So we are in the average presence of migrants between EU countries, in spite of a very strong discourse against migration, which is mainly led by the extreme right. Most of the entrances are students, because France wants to have a presence in many countries around. So most of the legal entrances are students, followed by asylum seekers, and then family reunification and labor force. Labor force very few, because we are we did not open like Germany recently the labor market to extra European foreigners. So what was the most factor of legal entrance in the past, in the 70s, now are just 15% of the legal entrances. For the asylum seekers, the first number are Afghans. Why? Because we have a border with the UK, and many Afghans want to cross the channel, and so they are arrived at the last point of Europe, which is France, in the western geography of Europe, and they try to cross the channel. There are dead people, but there are also successes, and we have an agreement which is named the 2K agreement, which was strangely concluded in 2002 and renewed in 2022. In order, we are the only one country in Europe to make the containment for another European country, even if it is not in the EU. So it is a very strange situation, because we have a lot of people camping there in the so-called jungle, and it is very difficult to solve this question, because most of these Afghans don't want to require asylum in France, but they want to go to UK for asylum, but also for work. The other asylum seekers, the number two, are the people from Congo, because they are French-speaking people. The political situation is very critical, so they try to come to France as asylum seekers. And among other nationalities, there is Maghreb, mostly Tunisia, for example. But the first legal entrance, except for asylum seekers, are Maghrebians, because we have a lot of connections with language connections, historical connection with Maghreb. So students, asylum seekers, but also family reunification and workers. As for the Ukrainians, we have just 4% of the Ukrainians in Europe. So it is very small compared with some countries like in Middle Europa, and rather few Syrians, quite no Albanians. And so the situation of France is very different from other neighbor countries in other countries in Europe. If we compare, for example, with Switzerland, it is not at all the presence of Turkish populations. There are rather few. So we have our migrants, which is linked to the neighborhood, historical neighborhood, but also geographical neighborhood.
Thank you. And what is the situation like in the neighboring country, in Italy?
I have some slides to present to be more clear, I hope. Thank you for having me, first of all. And I think what is particularly striking in Italy is the distance between the discourse and the reality, the figures about migration and especially about asylum. Here, the slides. So, just to start, what is the common vision shared the majority of Italian electors, I can say? First point, Italians are convinced that there is a strong increase of immigration in numbers in our country. Second, asylum is seen as the main reason. There are landings, and people see landings on the TV, and they are convinced that there is a dramatic inflow of immigrants. They overlap landed people, refugees, and immigrants, more or less seen as the same population. Third point, migrants are seen as young Muslim men coming from the Middle East or from Africa. numbers, figures that we have. The first point is that immigration in my country is stable. About 5.3 million of people in a regular, in a legal status, plus probably 500,000 irregular immigrants. The main reasons for the presence, as Rainer Münz has showed, are work and family reasons. Refugees and asylum seekers are actually 0.45 million. So a tiny minority, about 8% of the total immigrant population. But our public discussion has taken this trend, discussing asylum as if it would be immigration. Relevant point is also that the majority of migrants in Italy are women, and almost half are European. The first country of origin is Romania. The second is Albania. And for what regards the culture and religious affiliation, 3 out of 5 come from traditional Christian countries. So the main problem, I think, in our discussion about immigration is this distance between the discussion and the reality. Please. In general, native citizens overestimate the number of immigrants in every European country, but Italy is at the top of the ranking. The perception is at about 26%, while the reality is at 9%. So it means that Italians see 3 times the number of immigrants actually living in this country. They see about 17 or 18 million of immigrants in our cities, while there are 6 million of immigrants. Why this occurs? It is an important sociological question that I can treat only in a few words. I think that the reason is that Italy is the only country, the first reason, is the only country that has not experienced an economic growth since the introduction of the euro, the single currency. So Italians are very disappointed about their economic situation, about the lack of future, the lack of perspective, the worsening of their living conditions, and they project their disappointments, their anxieties and fears on the presence of immigrants. They are, if you want, the scapegoat of our economic and social difficulties. I stop here because there are time for other answers later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what is the situation like if we look at it from out of the EU a little bit, but from the Western Balkans?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And thank you for putting this topic on the agenda. I mean, what you have just explained about Italy, I think really kind of resonates with most of European countries, that fears are projected, that realities are something different from the actual, perceptions are different from the actual realities on the ground. When we talk about the Western Balkans, I would like to expand this a little bit. And maybe just mention 3 or 4 dimensions of migration. On one hand, you have the top news in the last decade or so from the Western Balkans has been emigration. People leaving the countries. People leaving any country from Bosnia to Serbia to North Macedonia. And I'm talking about mass migration. I'm talking about anything between 20,000 to 50,000 people. So small towns being lost in a course of 1 year. And we have been looking at the reasons why people are leaving. We have been looking at first financial circumstances, the economy. But then it kind of, more research that has been produced also generated results that it's not only the economic basis, but it's also disappointment. It's basically the politics that is always in constant turmoil, uncertainties around it, and simply this wait for the EU bid, being the region that is trying to be a part of the European accession process or be part of the Europe. This convergence doesn't happen overnight. And if you look at the numbers on the World Bank, it's not going to happen even in our lifetime. And people simply decide to go to Europe rather than wait for Europe. Second dimension of the story is that has been kind of overlooked in presentations so far a little bit, is the fact that we are demographically getting older. And when I say we, it's not only the Western Balkans, it's also Austria, where we're sitting at the moment. It's Germany, it's any country you can pick in the European Union. And this, the population can be seen through all sorts of different sort of parameters, including lower birth rates that are related to the fact that women, for example, have never been more educated than now. So there's a choice that has been also put forward. And you cannot really see it in a very narrow-minded sort of way, you know, this is only birth rates and fertility rates. It's also other things. It's also possibilities to be mobile. It's the fact that we can move around, that we can go to any country. So the demography is really playing quite an important sort of element in this story, and the population as such. The third element that I would mention is migration that we have mentioned. Western Balkan route has been mentioned many times from the beginning of the presentation, but it has been also known from 2015 when the wave has started from Syria. And we have seen that the route is there, it's changing. As of yesterday, we know, for example, that Serbia is not a hotspot anymore, but many migrants, I'm talking about Afghans, I'm talking about Iraqis, probably also Pakistanis, that they're actually choosing now Bosnia because it's easy to penetrate. We have also seen incredible pushback from Croatia, for example, and brutality that has been recorded and documented by Amnesty International, by all sorts of different organizations, how actually migration waves are playing about in the Western Balkans. And we have seen that the numbers are steady. They haven't really changed as much because we always have summertime, springtime, when there is more people coming, and then there is a little bit of a hold during winter times. But what the fourth dimension, I think the most interesting for me, and I have recently published a little piece for the European Council on Foreign Relations, is actually immigration into the region that virtually didn't know any immigration at all. So all of a sudden you have labor shortages, you have people that have left, you have very poor demographic situation, you have migration that is also bringing somewhat uncertainty, and then you have basically no people to be employed. And in this case, and this is really happening for the first time, as of the last year, you had more Nepalese workers in Croatia working in tourism than Bosnians, Albanians, and Serbs combined. This has never happened before. This is really, really interesting because it profoundly changes the way we see immigration. I mean, again, it's very important to understand that this region hasn't really been recognized for immigration. It was always, you know, talent, sort of rich place where we export people and not import them. And all of a sudden, you have Bangladeshis, you have Nepalese, you have people from all over Asia coming in really large numbers. And not only that they're coming, but they're being actively attracted. If you look at the advertisements from Croatian companies, Serbian companies, business associations, they offer packages, they offer visas, they offer transportation, they offer language courses, and more you see integration actually is putting forward is being put forward in this respect. There's also something really interesting about the Western Balkans, and I will end here because I could continue. It's the war basically that we have seen in Ukraine that has brought also interesting dynamics in Serbia, for example. Serbia was the only country, if you remember, that allowed Russians to enter country without visas. And you had these flights, if you remember, in February 2022, and then in March, and then when full mobilization has been announced, you had an influx of Russians coming, really large numbers to Serbia. What has happened is that not all of them, but many of them actually really fit well within the labor market. Many of them run their own companies. According to the latest statistics from the Business Association in Serbia, there are around 9,000 new companies being enacted, being established by the Russians in Serbia. And number of entries is more than 500,000. And if you dismiss half of it even, you can see that there is a change in dynamics there. So I think there are many sort of elements in the Western Balkans that makes it extremely interesting to observe and to do research on, apart from what we have mentioned before, which is obviously migration as such and a number of entries, whether it's illegal, whether it's refugees, asylum seekers, but there are other sort of things around that could be observed.
Thank you very much for this observation, Alita. I think this is something that we usually don't think about in the first place when we talk about Western Balkans, because discussion is so much dominated by the Balkan route that we remain oblivious to what you just said about immigration to the region.
Exactly.
There is also a very interesting paper that you worked on that you published recently. So I believe that if someone is interested, we can share it after the discussion per mail. Just write to us if you're interested.
Absolutely.
We are now coming closer to Visegrad countries, and Vito and I will probably have a bit to say, make for short, a bit to say about new dynamics here. Let's start with Czech and Slovakia. What are the new dynamics in migration flows there, Vito?
Okay, well, to put it in a nutshell, Russian aggression against Ukraine has been a game changer, because from that moment on, we have vast numbers of refugees. When I talk about the situation before February 2022, I have to stress that the Czech Republic is slightly different from the pattern observable among the Central Eastern European member countries of the European Union, which are the countries which are constantly downsizing when it comes to the number of the population, countries that are typically like exporting the labor migrants to Western European countries. Some of them are settling them there permanently, some of them are returning back. The share of the foreigners in these countries is comparably lower when we take the Western European average as sort of comparison or point for comparison. But the Czech Republic is slightly different. The Czech Republic still remains, and it's been such for almost a decade. So the Czech Republic is the only country of Central and Eastern European members of the European Union which increased its population. But this increase was only thanks to the migrants. We don't have any miracle formula to foster our fertility rates. We are suffering the same problems as entire Europe did. So it means that we are bigger thanks to the migrants. Describing the current pattern, Czech Republic crossed over the hurdle of 10% of the inhabitants being foreigners, being the people with permanent or temporary residence permit, or people, Ukrainians who are benefiting from the temporary protection system. So it means that we have more than 1,065,000 of foreigners living at the territory of the Czech Republic. The vast majority of them are coming from Ukraine. This is the biggest, uncomparable to any other group of the foreigners living in the Czech Republic. But we have some other interesting minorities. We have Slovak minority, of course, because of the historical, linguistic, and other proximities. We have roughly 70,000 of Vietnamese living at the territory of Czech Republic, which again can be explained by some historical dependence on the cooperation launched already in the late 1970s, early 1980s between communist Vietnam and communist Czechoslovakia, and many of these people are staying, and their kids are naturalized inhabitants, citizens of the Czech Republic. And we have other migrants as well. absolute majority of the migrants coming to the Czech Republic and to other Central and Eastern European countries are the migrants coming from other European countries. If I take into consideration, for example, the numbers of the asylum seekers in the Czech Republic, the number is approximately around 2.5 thousands of applications of asylum seekers a year, which compared to Western European countries is not any high number. We are not the resident country for the asylum seekers. We are more a transit country when it comes to the people migrating, for example, from Africa or Middle East. And for some reasons, crossing the Czech Republic, they are definitely not willing to settle in the Czech Republic. So these are the trends. One thing that is important to notice, there is certain discrepancy, and I guess that we will talk about this more later on, but there is certain discrepancy between the political debate for migration, which is very much negative and very much impacted by these false pictures of Muslim migrants willing to endanger the classical Czech Christian culture. But in practices, the living of the migrants, including the Ukrainians in the Czech Republic, is not that difficult because the Czech Republic has a long tradition of workers migrants from Ukraine. For example, our construction industry and some services wouldn't be possible without these Ukrainian workers, which means that the Czech labor market, which is suffering from the lack of skilled as well as unskilled labor force, we are able to consume these migrants without any problem, which practically means that, for example, up to 70% of these Ukrainians living under the temporary residence permission in the Czech Republic are participating in the labor market. And if you look purely at the economic data, then you can come very easily to conclusion that we are like getting much of these migrants than we are spending on them. So even economically it makes a deal. And experts are suggesting the Czech politicians, sometimes without any success, hey guys, look at these Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian people living in the Czech Republic. We have to do the best to remain them here, not to push them back to Ukraine after the end of the conflict.
Thank you very much. I think what we sometimes forget when talking about the Czech Republic, this is the country which hosts most Ukrainian refugees per 100 inhabitants. We think about Germany, we think about Poland, but it's actually the Czech Republic that is
Followed by Poland and followed by Slovakia.
Absolutely. And now coming to Poland, Poland is actually a country that has experienced tremendous changes in the last 4 or 5 years. Because as was already mentioned during the keynote lecture, it is a country with a relatively low share of foreigners or foreign-born citizens. Poland is also a very homogeneous country when it comes to culture, when it comes to ethnicity and language. It does not have much experience with taking up refugees, except for in the late 90s, early 2000s, Chechen refugees who were, by the way, Muslim, and this didn't cause really a stir or emotional debate back then. Poland has also been known for a notorious 2015 Visegrad Group stance on the long summer of migration. But three migration flows changed since then, I would say. And I would start with 2020 and with Belarus and the crackdown of the regime against peaceful demonstrations after the elections back then, which led to really mass migration from the country, not only political dissidents, but also young people who were very often disillusioned, to especially two neighboring countries, and that was Poland and Lithuania. And just to give you a couple of numbers, before 2020, there were around 38,000 Belarusians living legally in Poland, either working or studying. Right now, there are over 120,000. And we know also that there is a second wave, so to say, I don't like to use the word wave, but still coming from Lithuania, because due to the political situations, also elections coming, many of them feel unwelcome then and are coming to Poland now. The second dynamic starts in late summer 2021 and has also to do with Belarus. But this time it is about instrumentalization of migration by the Belarusian regime, by which Lukashenko's regime brought migrants, among the refugees as well, from Asia, from Africa, to the border with the EU, so to the border with Poland, but also Lithuania and Latvia, and help them cross the border. On the one hand, many people that believe that it's an easy access, a safe road to the EU. Many just saw it as a chance to get there this way. The Polish government, also Lithuanian government, reacted very decisively. So walls were erected. In both countries, at some point, pushbacks were legalized. In Poland, there was no border, no entry zone for anyone by military, security guards, or local residents, which meant no NGOs, no medics, no legal assistance there. And then the third dynamic is, I guess, obvious, and this is the refugee. There were refugees from Ukraine after February 2022. A couple of observations are also related to the keynote is that they were very much welcomed by the society. There was a political will here, which was also in the case of Belarusians, but it was not there in case of the situations at the EU-Belarus border. It's true that very many of them work, over 60%. But at the same time, what Poland had and other countries often did not is, first of all, the similarity in language, which really helps. It's easier to learn Polish than it is to learn German. That's the network, and network also has connections and helps find employment in the country and in the destination country. It is also that in many ways, those people who are in Poland right now under the TPD, Temporary Protection Directive, are, for example, less skilled than those who are in Austria. And if you are more educated, you may also demand a different type of job. But for this type of job, you again may need a language. So this also is an explanation for why maybe there are fewer Ukrainians working in Germany than they are in Poland. But we're now changed the topic a little bit. Just a couple of weeks ago, on the 10th of April, European Parliament adopted 10 legislative pacts to reform a European migration and asylum policy. How was it perceived in your countries by the political parties, also by the civil society? And let's start with France again.
Yes, the European Pact was not a real debate inside the public opinion, which does not understand so much except for active associations. And at the European Parliament in Strasbourg and Brussels, according to some European MPs, the extreme right was quite absent from the debate in the Parliament, as well as the right and also the Socialist Party. So the parties we were discussing mostly were Renaissance, the party of Macron, and also the Green people and the extreme left. But most of the discussions were focused on the question of how was led the negotiation, much more than what about the content. And in fact, in the European Pact, the discussion, there were 9 points first, which were proposed for the discussion by the European Commission. But at the Parliament, there were mostly 4 points which were discussed, mostly on refugee, quite nothing on immigration. And so if we don't link immigration with the refugee question, we don't say anything because it is very mixed, especially with so mixed flows we have now in Europe. So what decided first, mostly a security approach about refugees between the 27, with a rapid exam for those coming from countries where there is less than 20% of their nationality, which gets the asylum status, which is not very good for the individual profile of most of them. Activate the coming back to the transit country and their presence in the detention centers. We don't change much about the Dublin Agreement because it is very comfortable to have these agreements with one-stop, one-shop, especially for Mittel-Europa and also for the Nordic countries, because the border is mostly managed by the south of Europe, so Italy, Greece, Malta, and so on, without it is the last border of Europe. The first is the activating the externalization of the management of borders with the south rim of the Mediterranean, but further with Rwanda for the discourse of the UK and some other countries. But the real border is the job is made by southern Mediterranean European countries mostly. So it is so comfortable that it was not really discussed. There is a notion of third safe countries, not just safe countries, but third safe country, transit countries. And if these transit countries are considered as safe, it is very difficult to get the asylum status. And the last point was in case of exceptional circumstances, there is a stronger treatment of newcomers in that cases. For the countries, because we have met an East-West debate about welcoming the newcomers in the 2015, for those countries which are refusing to welcome asylum seekers, it was decided to ask them to pay 20,000 euro for each person which is not accepted by this country, so they will pay. There is also, it is a kind of solidarity tax between EU countries, between Eastern and Western countries. There is also the following externalization policy with the south rim of Mediterranean. And there is a very small harmonization of asylum, which was presented of what could bring the new pact, but finally it was not made because every asylum seeker has not the same chances with the same profile to be accepted or not as a refugee according to the diplomacy and the neighborhood of each neighbor country. So the essential of the pact was about the possibility or not of negotiation, not about the content of the pact, which did not speak about immigration, as I told, just 4 points were discussed instead of the 9 points which were proposed by the Commission.
Thank you very much. And how about Italy?
Yeah,
a couple of slides.
Make reference to my slides to be more clear, also essential in my answer. The first point is to make more clear the situation of refugees in the world and in Europe. Actually, 75% of refugees are hosted in low or middle income countries, around a third in the poorest countries overall. Europe in 2021 welcomed less than 10% of refugees of the world, according to Eurostat. In 2022, Ukrainians arrived, so the rate increased, but it is 14%. And to complete the picture, almost half of refugees in the world are women, and over 40% are minors. Then, the countries most involved in reception are Turkey first, Iran, probably this year Iran will take the first place. In relation to the inhabitants, Lebanon is the first, 1 refugee out of 7 inhabitants. In the European Union, Sweden, 1 in 40 inhabitants. Italy receives 1 refugee in 175 inhabitants, about 6 refugees per 1,000 inhabitants. We are under the average of Western Europe, but Italians are convinced of the contrary. So we have in Italy in this moment 3 immigration policies, and probably in the European Union there is something similar. Italy has in some way anticipated and highlighted some trends. The first policy is closure towards asylum seekers arriving from the south of the world. The second is a good reception of Ukrainian refugees. And the new trend, the new point is the new demand for workers. And not only highly qualified ones. You talked about Croatia and the Western Balkan countries. In Italy, the present government, that is not famous for sympathy towards immigrants, has issued a decree that has decided to receive 450,000 new immigrants in 3 years. So a very high numbers. If you consider also family reunifications, probably in 10 years, we will have 1 million immigrants more than now.
Yeah.
Please. So the new pact has to be placed into this framework. The first point is the prevention of unwanted arrivals and repatriation as the main priorities. Returns in the English version issued in September was mentioned more than 90 times. It is an obsession to return illegally, an obsession. The external dimension of immigration policy is emphasized, especially towards the transit countries. It is easier to send people or to stop people in sending in transit countries than in the origin countries. The new pact has emphasized a more efficient procedure of identification at the border, a rapid examination of asylum requests, a prevention of secondary movements across our neighbors, across other European countries. The last point that most emphasized in the Italian debate is a soft reform of Dublin's rules. Professor Catherine Vitol de Van Den has already highlighted this point. So the possibility of some redistribution of asylum seekers, 30,000 every year, but with a possibility of an economic compensation. So some soft reform of Dublin's rules. The Italian debate, to conclude. The government has judged positively the new pact, highlighting a convergence of the European Union towards its position. So the rhetoric is the European Union has understood and has followed our vision. The Italian Prime Minister has invited Ursula von der Leyen to visit the island of Lampedusa. They have released a press conference, and Ursula von der Leyen has announced a 10 points policy about asylum mainly. And Giorgia Meloni has said we are completely on the same line. So the convergence between Italian government and the European Union, but with the vision that the European Union has changed and has adopted the Italian line. On the other side, NGOs and civil society have criticized the pact. The center-left parties voted against at the European Parliament, taking a distance from the other center-left parties at the European Parliament. From the right, the League stood out, judging the new pact too soft, so has taken a different position from the head of the Italian government. There are European elections in June, so they need to take a distance to make more visible their position, please. So I think the evaluation is that the European Union and the Italian government need to show results before the European elections. So the emphasis on the pact as an historical turning point appears, in my opinion, excessive. As I said, there is a progressive convergence with the sovereignist line of the Italian government and other right parties in Europe. There is a progress towards a shared governance of asylum, but at a high price from the point of view of the protection of human rights. Last point, I think the issue of implementation has been neglected. It is easy to write on a pact that they will analyze asylum requests in 12 weeks. But to implement this point requires officials to examine asylum requests, requires agreements with countries of origin, requires funds for repatriations and so on. So in my opinion, the new pact will have some issues in its implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for juxtaposing numbers with reality and showing sometimes how different and far from one another they are. Use the word obsession, and I would jump in because this pact seemed to be an obsession of Polish political parties, all of them. Each of them was against for very different reasons. But there was one aspect of it that particularly was or had been present for a very long time in the public debate, and it's the subject of relocations. Because as we already talked before, Poland was one of the countries that already opposed a relocation scheme in 2015. And right now it was interesting to observe that the two largest political players, so the Civic Coalition, which is right now the ruling party, and the previous ruling party, Law and Justice, oppose it for the same reason. They say, like, no, we don't want to let all those illegal migrants in. And for a long time, Law and Justice was trying to use it in a political debate against the Civic Coalition, against its opponent, claiming they will let them in. And our Civic Coalition is the one saying, no, no, we'll not let them in, but don't trust them. And this is, in a way, also a paradox, because I talk about those other numbers before, like how many Belarusians are there, and it doesn't cause really any emotional debate because it's like 80,000 people more. And then even if there were people coming in the aftermath of relocations, we talk about a couple of thousand, if at all. And this causes such a emotional debate already right now. So I would be curious to know, it is similar, for example, in Czechia.
Well, yes, it is. The debate is the same. Almost all the political parties are trying to explain why the migration pact is not a good deal. On the other hand, we have to differentiate between the domestic debates and the behavior of at least Czechia and Slovakia within the EU institutions. Both Slovak Prime Minister Fico and major Czech political parties, especially those who are now in position. They are criticizing heavily the Migration Pact. They are saying they are not going to accept the rules and they are going to fight against it. On the other hand, when it comes to the official approval, let's say in the council, then neither Czechia nor Slovakia have voiced any serious concerns about the Migration Pact. And it makes sense because the Migration Pact in many ways is addressing exactly the same issues we wanted to share with our EU partners back in 2015, 2016 in a very nasty and very wrong way. But on the other hand, most of these principles are there. No forced relocations. We can compensate for not willing to participate in the relocation mechanism with money or with some material or physical assistance to the countries that are exposed to the migrant waves. That was exactly what we wanted. There are some rules that might make us believe that we might keep migration slightly more under control, that we will be better informed about who is actually trying to come into the European Union. So every main concerns from Central and Eastern Europe were addressed in the pact. I would be slightly optimistic. I don't think that the fact is solution. As you pointed out, the question is to what extent all these wonderful ideas are going to get materialized, because there are some technical details that might not work according to the wording of the pact in practices. But the very fact that there are two strong groups strongly opposing the Migration Pact, and it is European far right and some human rights NGOs, it might be a sign that the Migration Pact might be a reasonable compromise. At least we have to recognize very positively the fact that there has been a broad consensus on the Migration Pact. I understand that everybody can be unhappy with the Migration Pact from different reasons. On the other hand, this is how the compromises are working. And if you take into consideration 27 countries of the European Union with completely different migration path dependence, migration regimes, we are facing really different kind of issues than, say, for example, Sweden or Italy or Malta. Well, then apparently we have to find some compromises. And if nothing, then the Migration Pact has the potential to get the situation slightly better than it is now. And for me, I'm sorry, after observing all these political clashes since 2014, 2015 on, well, fair enough.
Thank you for bringing some silver linings to our last positive assessment of it. Alida, how was it perceived in Western Balkans?
Well, Western Balkans differs in this sense because the region itself is not on equal footing with the rest of the European Union. So it doesn't have a voice to fully represent the whole issue. So I haven't really heard in the actual debate about the pact. What you did have was basically a reaction or feedback by the international organizations dealing with migration one way or the other. And it has been seen two-folded as a potential opportunity, as we have said, because solidarity is in the center of it, but also lots of concerns around it. And concerns are related mostly with the violation of human rights, further pushbacks. Also, there is a provision of 2 years to harmonize your national legislation within the overarching pact. So it always depends how countries will basically how they will play out this legislative point, but also operationally how this will play out. So there are main concerns around that, and I think we should see it really in the light of the forthcoming EU elections, because this is going to be, you know, one of the pull and push factors for many parties. We have seen now in related to the immigrants that have arrived in Croatia, we have seen some surveys recently being done that really is polarizing to a certain extent national debates. You have you know, people coming in, they're not speaking your language. You need to go to the shop, like basic things, and then you're not even able to communicate in your native language. And then again, you need those people to come in. It has to be seen also from that point of view. Again, for the Western Balkan point, now it's really about either attracting your own immigrants or attracting immigrants from far east or wherever they come from. Looking at the projections, UN projections, every single country of the region is shrinking. I've just looked at the data for Serbia, for example. In the last decade, Serbia lost 500,000 people. And your projection by the end of the century, currently Serbia stands at 6.6 million. By the end of the century, that will halve to 3.2 million. So we're talking about really strong depopulation that needs to be replaced either by your own people or people from abroad. So yeah, it's a somewhat different, I would say, angle from the Western Balkans.
There's also already a couple of you mentioned elections and European elections coming. This brings me to my next question. But before I pose it, I also want to give you a chance to at least signal your questions. So if anyone here in the audience has one, please raise your hand. Okay, I will start there at the back. Okay, could you tell us who you address it at?
Yes, the colleague from Bosnia, maybe. My name is Günther Felling. I'm activist for the Albanians in Austria, actually. My question is about exactly this. Why are we not ready to grant the Albanians and all EU candidate countries the same status like EU citizens with free movement and access to the labor market and take them out of all this equation of the asylum and of the refugee crisis? Because that's most of them, as we have learned today, the Ukrainians and the Albanians and the other Western Balkan people. And so we would relieve our asylum systems and a little bit get a more rational debate. And there are EU candidates already, so we could easily give them this status.
Okay, maybe collect questions. Also, Camila.
Good evening. I'm Camila Bogdanova. I'm a research assistant at the ITM, and my question is mostly addressed to the Professor Witkloszek and, of course, for the other panelists. I read some articles and I heard from my friends who are working in the refugee camps in Czech Republic for Ukrainians and Syrians or from the Middle East. And what I heard that there is a huge inequality and difference between living conditions and the overall treatment between the refugee camps for Ukrainians and Syrians. Is there somehow an issue for the human rights organizations in Czech Republic or between policymakers? And the question also addressed for the other panelists, if there is the same tendency in your countries. Thank you.
Let me start with the first question. Alida, which was directed to you.
Yes, I mean, I don't have an answer, obviously, because this is a matter of political decision, right? We're talking about a region that is relatively small. We're talking about Kosovars that have only recently managed to get through the visa liberalization process after so many years without having any reasonable grounds for holding them for so long. We have candidacy status in some countries. We have front runners like Serbia without an actual content of the reforms. So it's a very, and that has been sort of changed to some degree when Ukrainian war started, because there was a necessity now to look at other countries as a potential enlargement sort of piece. But I'm just, again, this is a $1 million question, why policymakers are not as reasonable to see a little bit further, to see a little bit beyond, to basically unburden themselves on one hand, but also ease the situation in the countries such as Austria. Yeah.
Thank you. The second question is regarding the different treatments.
Well, maybe I will start because I was addressed. I will just add one or two sentences to what you said. Well, and I don't mean to say that I am opposing the further enlargement of the European Union, just on the contrary. But if you look at political dynamics of the enlargement, there is something that the experts are calling already for the last couple of years as integration fatigue. And the integration fatigue has two sides. This is a coin on which there is one side. The candidate countries are not coping that well with all these claims and all these compliance that is necessary for entering the European Union. Experts are talking about shallow Europeanization, even de-Europeanization, which would be a very complicated debate, but let's put it like this. And then there is a lack of will to integrate new countries on the side of the European Union. And I'm not saying that it is a good thing, but that's the way it is. And within such a context, there are no incentives for the local politicians in the member states to be more active and, for example, to take steps making the, let's say, admission of the people from the countries easier, which in my way, in my humble opinion, would be a reasonable policy, but there are many reasons why this policy is not followed actually by the European politicians. And now going to the difference between the Ukrainian and Syrian refugees, well, I'm afraid to say that it is not an issue at all in the Czech Republic, and the reason is very clear. It would be a misinterpretation to say that we Czechs are not willing to accept any foreigners, any migrants. This is not the case. As I said, we have 10% of our population being the people born in another country than the Czech Republic, being the people without the Czech citizenship. But the problem is that we, and by we, I mean the Czech public and the Czech politicians, we are differentiating a lot among different groups of migrants. So we are absolutely willing to get Slovaks because they are more or less the same as we are. We do not have much problems with the migrants coming from European countries, not only Ukrainians, but from European countries. We had back in the 1990s quite substantial inflow of temporary migrants, temporary refugees coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, and these people were without much problems integrated in the Czech society, and many of them returned back, and some of them still live in the Czech Republic without any problems. But when it comes to the migrants from non-European countries, and especially from countries with the Muslim population, this is something that the Czech public and the Czech politicians are not willing to accept. And that's why the political debate about migration is so heated up. It's not the Czech exception. I think that we can use this explanation all around the Central Eastern European member countries of the European Union. The problem is that we do not have many of these people. The number of Syrian refugees in our camps is very limited compared to the number of Ukrainians. They might be treated differently, and if they are, well, then definitely there is no politician to bother with this, because it actually fits into whom we want to have in the Czech Republic, I mean the Czech population, and who shall remain beyond the borders of the country. Well, how to explain it? It's difficult. It's for a sociological, historical discussion, which can last for hours. But to simplify a lot, we do not have many experiences with the migrants or with the ethnic minorities of non-European origins. And therefore, we are prone to exaggerate, well, even to the higher extent than the Italian public does, how these people look like. If you follow the political debate in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Baltic countries, elsewhere in the region, who is the typical migrant? In the eyes of the population, it's young, male, Muslim, who wants to go to the Czech Republic, misuse our social system, misuse our funding, and undermine the societal and cultural and civilization consensus we have. In fact, we don't have any migrants like this. We had experience in the period of 2015-2016, 16, less than our group here in the room is 16 Iranian refugees were relocated to the Czech Republic. Czech Republic decided, okay, we will take 16, like 4 families. Well, they left after half a year because they said, well, we don't feel well here. Although they were supported, assisted by the Czech administration, and they finally ended up in Germany, I guess. So that's the reality. But the picture, social construction of the migrant, political construction of the migrant is quite different from the reality. So we are not that racist. In a way, we are.
I say that the political also plays a part in looking at it from the Polish perspective and answering your question, and a little bit the next question that I wanted to ask about elections and politics. In Poland, as I mentioned before, we took up Chechen refugees, and there was really no emotional debate about it. In 2015, actually, prior to the elections, there was also not that much of a debate, at least not as heated. And it was only with Law and Justice that this debate enter into the public sphere so much. And then this image of, you know, they are coming, they are different, they are all criminals actually appeared there. Then it disappeared for a while because no one, if you try to scourge someone all the time, then it doesn't work anymore. So in the next elections, this topic was not there anymore. And then after the case at the EU-Belarus border appeared, then migration was used again. But it was not as successful as you would think. I mean, Law and Justice still didn't manage to win enough seats in the parliament, because how long can it actually work? And that's my question, which I will try to combine with other questions which are appearing here also on the screen. But we are ahead of European elections. We have a year with the unprecedented number of elections around the globe. And does migration still work as a topic in campaigns? Catherine, I will start with
Yes,
you.
of course. Yes,
Mhm.
especially in France, because the National Front is, the Rassemblement National is perceived as perhaps one of the first party to have new MPs at the European Parliament for the next election. So it is a real fear in France because it may announce the result also of the presidential elections of 2027. And there is a fear, but there is a gap between and this importance of the Rassemblement National, which is the extreme right, brings a gap between the reality and the perception. It is the main problem we have in France, because we have had still during the last presidential election, the debate led by Zemmour about the so-called grand remplacement, the great replacement of newcomers from Muslim cultures from the south with inside the so-called French population, which is very diverse, but which is described by extreme right as totally homogeneous. So it is a debate. And also the fear telling Africa will invade us. The debate is very present. And we have to avoid the so-called appel d'air. So we have to lead very small social offers in order to dissuade the newcomers. In fact, the newcomers are not really interested by the social help we have in France, which are quite known for the newcomers, especially if they are illegals. But the debate is very present, especially led by extreme rightist opinion and the party. So the debate is very, very important because there is a lack of education about the topic. If we say that Louis XIV was born in the 19th century, the population would say, no, it is not true. But if the extreme right says there are 20% immigrants in France, they will say yes, because they don't know. And all the more there are very few migrants in some regions, rural regions in France, all the more there will be really reluctant to migrants from outside Europe. But in the reality, it is very different. We have a long experience with Maghrebians because it was our main colonies. The polls about integration led by the Institute for National Studies, INED, say integration works in spite of all the discrimination, difficulties to have access to employment, so-called inner cities and so on. In fact, it works. We are the champion for mixed marriages in Europe. Most people from second generation are double nationals with their country and also with the French nationality code. So the reality is very different from the debate, but inside I have to say here, because it is not so well known, that the presence of the so-called pieds noirs especially in the south of France, where they settled after the end of the Algerian war, after the end of the Tunisia and Morocco protectorates with France, has a very strong impact on the debate about putting the Arabs outside. And it is a very strong topic, especially in the far right activist movements now in France.
You also cited many positive examples. If you could answer in one word, would you say that migration in France is a challenge or opportunity? Coming back to the discussion.
I think it is neither. It is a challenge, but neither an opportunity, neither a catastrophe. It is a reality, and we have to deal with this reality and to take into account the question of integration. France is the oldest immigration country in Europe. It began in mid-19th century, but most of French are not at all conscious of that, don't accept that France is a country also not just of labor force, but of settlement. And so I think the role of education is crucial in changing the mentalities about migration.
Thank you very much. Can education help to change the mentality in other countries? What is the situation like in Italy, in elections?
I have again some slides to show about the political perspectives. The following. Yes. Clearly, immigration has achieved a high priority in the political agenda in Italy for several years, and especially in the campaigns of national populist political forces. The political right and also the populist party, the movement 5 Stars, have to profit from this rhetoric about the invasion, the huge numbers of immigrants. And what is even worse, they have achieved a sort of a cultural hegemony. I listened to politicians from the left saying, we cannot stop immigration and then we have to manage it. And they don't realize the hidden side of this argument. If it is possible to stop, we would stop. We would not like immigration, but we accept the fact that immigration is a reality. They have followed the hegemony of the right on this point. The center-left was influenced by it and adopting an oscillating line. The agreement with Libya was signed by a center-left government. The first attacks against NGOs rescuing people in the sea were made under center-left government. Center-left gives its best when they are in opposition. When they are in office, they oscillate. Please. So the government and the Italian right managed to keep tension high on refugees arriving from the south, not the Ukrainians. And now they have emphasized the decrease in landings. We do not know if it is actually the result of the agreement with Tunisia or simply the effect of the meteo, because meteo has influenced the arrival by the sea. At the same time, I mentioned before the fact that they have issued a decree for the arrival of 450,000 new workers, but they leave at this point in the shadows. They don't talk about this. They emphasize the problem of invasion of refugees, the agreements with Tunisia, with Libya, the new European Pact, on this point. And they exploit on the internal side the tensions caused by the multi-ethnic evolution of the Italian society. For instance, opposition against the establishment of all of prayers for Muslim immigrants. This is a huge point of debate. A school in Italy some weeks ago has declared a day of holiday for the end of Ramadan. That is perfectly legal in the Italian rules for the management of the school calendars. It became a national problem, a national issue, first line in the news, with the opposition of the minister, of the government, or the mayor against this decision. So at the European Union level, I think that also here, immigration is a key point in the political agenda because mainstream parties fear the advance of the populist right, as in France. The Pact, my vision, probably aimed to contain this problem, the advance of the populist right, but they did it adopting their vision and their priorities. And I think that in the next future, the European Union and various national governments will also have to manage the tension between closure towards refugees, and they say migrants in general often, and the new demand for workforce. This is, I think, the key point for our future. The fact that we need workers. We do not want to have refugees, but we need workers. Please.
I think it was the last.
Okay.
Yeah.
So education. I think it is useful, but not enough. As in many other countries, people who are against refugees come from internal regions, popular classes, unemployed, retired people, people with a low level of education, not from the big cities, for instance, or not so much. A key point is the exposure to the TV news. Italy is a country in which the crime has the highest level of resonance in news, in the TV. And this point is easily related to the immigration issues. I observed this afternoon here in Vienna, boys and girls, 10, 12 years old, going alone in the street. In Italy, especially in big cities, it would not be conceivable. Parents take the boys, girls at the school, they take back to home or to other social engagements. We have a huge level of fear about security, again, with a distance from actual figures. In Italy, we had about 1,200 killings 30 years ago. Now we have less than 300 killings every year. But people are convinced of the contrary if you interview a sample of Italian citizens. So immigration is related to this idea of a country in danger. So to conclude, education is relevant, but there is another point that is more relevant, in my opinion. Polls show that people who know immigrants have less fear about them. Is the contact hypothesis in social psychology. So if we are able to increase much more opportunities for meetings, for direct knowledge of people, probably the level of fear about immigrants could decrease. I think this is a challenge. There are many projects, associations, religious institutions working for this in Italy, but we have to increase this effort.
What I take from this is, from both of these actually, okay, education, but also more information and in a way exposure or communication between different groups. What you also mentioned was migration, the fact that we need workforce. This is something that we have already been touching upon many times before. What you were talking about, Alida, at the very beginning, this the Western Balkans needs at the moment. Is this thematized somehow in campaigns, political campaigns, electoral campaigns?
I think we're at the very interesting crossroad in the Western Balkans because we are at the very beginning of everything that you're going through. So we have no experience with actual immigration, not until now for the foreign labor. And we couldn't really articulate these debates in the proper way. I mean, the first kind of more serious contact that we had was during 2016, when the Syrian refugees started coming to the Western Balkan route. And exactly what you have said, this facilitation of contact happened sort of naturally without necessarily a government sitting together and planning this and crafting this and designing it. But it happened because many of these resource centers or asylum centers were actually located in the actual towns and the cities. And it kind of facilitated to some extent the contact between different people. And from that point of view, I don't think the situation in Western Balkans is at all bad, but because when you interview people, when you talk to people that are in contact with refugees, they will tell you that they're not the problem, they're not an issue. But when you hear the political debate, you will hear entirely different thing, right? So another interesting point that is happening in the Western Balkans is that you have other countries imposing their worldviews when it comes to refugees. And here I'm referring to Hungary, for example, that is in extremely sort of good relations these days with Serbia or Republika Srpska, one of the entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you have very frequent visits between the countries. You have discussions, and very often it's a very sort of a one-dimensional story. It's tradition, it's the family, it's us versus them. And in a way, you have sort of a third parties interfering and sort of putting forward their own narrative in the Western Balkans. And then, of course, you have useful grounds in the Western Balkans that are being used also by Italy in the new agreement between Albania and Italy, where you have basically a place where asylum seekers or refugees will be processed before, if they're rescued at the sea, they will be shipped to Albania rather than Italy. And this is a very new agreement between Edi Rama and the Meloni that is probably not one of the only one that exists, but it's a very kind of, new thing. It's a novelty in the region. And it's in a way, like instead of processing refugees and asylum seekers in your own country, you put them somewhere else and then you take care of the paperwork in your own country. It's a very, very different dynamic. So I would say it's we are at the beginning. It's going to be very interesting. We see some debate and we see some, especially where the immigrants are now coming from Asia. We see some interesting dynamics there. But it's going to be I think in the next 10 years that we're going to see major changes that will be taking place in the Western Balkans.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And you were already signalizing before that there seems to be a difference between the political debate and what the society thinks. Would you like to add something on what has been said?
Maybe a perspective of the coming European Parliament elections. As far as the Czech Republic and Slovakia are concerned, let's put it like this. Well, migration definitely will be one of the top 5 topics, but not that prominent one as it used to be in the second half of the previous decade, just after the migration crisis. Much more when it comes to the EU-wide topics, much more prominence will be placed on Green Deal, and of course on some economical and local issues. Still, we are talking about second-order elections, but migration will definitely be one of the issues on which the opposition will try to play against the governmental parties.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this discussion. I know that there was also a question in chat, but I promise that we'll pass it to our speakers and they will, I hope, if you have time, write an answer to that. Thank you very much again. Thank you to the audience for coming. And at this point, I would like to pass the floor for the final remarks to Yves Weisgut, Secretary General of the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe.
Thank you very much. After this rich debate, I think I will limit myself to a very few remarks. First of all, we're very happy to have this cooperation with IDM, and we'd like to thank you very much for hosting us here for what I think was a very interesting and very rich discussion. And the reason why we thought that we should deal with this in this context was, of course, on the one hand, the upcoming European elections. And as was mentioned, it might not be like a couple of years ago in all member states of the European Union, the most important topic or the very top of the list, but in all countries, I think it's definitely one of the key issues which will, to a certain extent, determine the outcome of the elections. The second reason why we also thought together with you from IDM, why we wanted to have a discussion on migration in this context was because it's very useful, I think, to bring in different perspectives. And I think this was started by the overview by Rainer Münz, of course, who has worked for many years on this topic as a key advisor to the European Commission. So I think it was useful sort of to juxtapose a bit the overall picture with a perspective from different member states, the Western Balkans, Central European perspective. What I think was striking was that everybody agreed that in virtually all countries within the European Union, outside, there's a big gap in perception and reality. And that is something I think which is, of course, part of the political debate everywhere, and which I think led to the fact that in most member states of the European Union in the past year or so, the far right, the national populists, to a certain extent, did manage to sort of shift the public discourse in a direction which ended up in the new Migration Pact, which was, I think, rightly pointed out as sort of establishing sort of a new consensus very much to the right of what it used to be 5 years ago. Now, the other thing is, of course, what this means in terms of implementation. It was also mentioned that it's one thing to put something on paper as a compromise where skeptical views were expressed, but where also the feeling was if this was where the consensus could develop around, it's better to have it than not to have it, perhaps. But we will have to see to what extent implementation will be an issue, to what extent it will be able to shift the debate. That is something, I think, which we will only be able to find out in the years to come, certainly only after the European elections. Another, I think, interesting aspect was, of course, the Western Balkans perception on demography and also the need for workforce. I think your example on Croatia was very interesting. And also, I think Professor Münz in his opening keynote speech pointed out that we might not have reached a turning point where we distinguish between sort of migration rather perceived as a threat, whereas time will come when even if we don't see it as an opportunity, we will need it. And that's a reality, I think, which all of us will face. And of course, that also opens a question which we could not have, due to lack of time, discussing in more detail tonight. The question, of course, will be this demand for labor. Will it be matched basically by the profile of migration in its different components? So we might still face this issue where we simply have migration with qualifications which do not match the demands for the labor force. And this is something, of course, which will be a huge question for the future. Once again, I would like to thank this marvelous panel for this, I think, very balanced, very rich discussion tonight, which I hope will have contributed, certainly for the audience, to clarify some of the facts and to do away with some of the misperceptions and bring sort of a sober perception into the discussion, which is sorely needed. Thank you very much.
Pleasure meeting.